They say the best revenge is success, but they never warn you how hollow it can taste when you have to swallow it in front of people who already decided you are nothing. I remember the way the chandelier threw light across the Langley dining room and caught on the pearl cufflinks of a man who spat words like they were small animals to be crushed. I remember feeling the whole future, like some knotted rope, tightening around my chest, and knowing that in a few weeks the same room would be the scene of something they could never undo. That memory held me like a promise while I sat there that night, waiting for the next tiny barb to land. I pulled the dented Honda into the gravel drive of the Langley estate with my hands steady and my face like a stage mask. Claire had texted me 100 times that afternoon, anxious and glossy and apologetic for her mother, for her father, for the way the house smelled like lemon oil and old money. Claire is the reason I stayed small in public. She laughs like a person who knows how to love things she can display, and I wanted to be the person she loved who lived outside the showroom. I wanted to test whether love could be real when you took the labels away. I did not want to tell them I had sold a company that changed how cities spoke to their infrastructure, or that I had signed the final papers on a donation that would keep their precious Langley Museum from folding. That last part was a private thing I had promised myself for reasons that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with a name carved into a plaque in my grandmother's handwriting. So I arrived as someone who drove a noisy old car and kept a simple job at a community tech collective, so Claire's family would have what they wanted to revile. The first course arrived like a chorus, polite and thin. Margaret Langley, mother, poured conversation and scorn with the same hand. Her eyes skimmed me in the way people check labels at an auction. She asked about my work with the soft cruelty of a woman who never needs to ask how a thing makes money. I told her I run a small workshop for high school kids who want to learn to code and build stuff, that I teach them how to make things that will help them get out of whatever corner life put them in. It was true in the way weather is true, and it felt enough for me. Her lips pursed. Her husband, Arthur, a man whose surname has its own headline, stapled a smile on like a fossil and made a joke about my car's probable breakdown before I could even say what model it was. Charity work, he said, like cough syrup, and everyone laughed. Not the whole laugh, not the kind that includes you. The kind that corrals you on a cold night. Claire's brother, Julian, took a slower path, like a predator that enjoys the slow rise of a bird's heart. He asked if I planned to move up someday, as if my current position were a broom closet and destiny was a penthouse. He dissected my college, my accent, the vintage watch I wear. Each sentence was a small tax on my dignity. They called my clothes charming and my car picturesque, while congratulating themselves on how generous they were to even allow me into the light of their home. Their barbs landed soft but precise, expert barbs, the kind that leave hairline cracks you don't notice until something heavy leans against them. Claire had been my quiet war. I watched her across the table as if I were learning a new language of betrayal and tenderness in the same breath. She clutched her napkin like it contained a truth she was not yet willing to make public. Sometimes she smiled at me with a kind of apologetic warmth that made my chest ache. Sometimes she was flushed with embarrassment and looked away like someone who had just been asked to concede an inheritance. She did speak up once, a small, frail defense that barely cut through the din. "He's passionate," she said, and the word hung there like a coin tossed into a well. Her mother smiled the way a queen might authorize a pardon and then withdraw it. "Passion is lovely," Margaret said, "but it does not fund the things people actually enjoy." I let them have their little victories over me. It was part of the test I had set for Claire and for myself. Each insult was a stone I catalogued, a ledger I balanced in my head for a future there would be no going back from. I felt a hot, righteous energy gather behind my ribs, the kind of energy that had once pushed me through 3 all-nighters to save a server cluster from collapse. It hummed now as if I were about to launch something that would finally be visible to the people who thought visibility was the only currency that mattered. I wanted Claire to choose me for who I was with no promises of silk or status. I wanted her to punch the air for me, or at least to say one sharp sentence that placed her with me when the moment mattered. Under the table, my knuckles whitened around a fork. The Langley estate was not just a home, it was a machine designed to make people feel minor. They had built their power on institutions, on boards and plaques and dinners, and it pricked at their pride that a simple man could show up and not be easily catalogued. They spoke of philanthropy the way carpenters speak of tools, naming it and measuring it, as if charity were a thing you could auction to the highest member of your social class. What they did not know, and what I hid behind my gentle, beaten-down smile, was that the thing they held above their mantle was a house of cards. There was a museum in our city the Langleys loved more than their vacations, and it was closer to folding than anyone knew. My choices that night were not about teaching Claire a lesson. They were about the instrument of memory I had sworn to keep alive, and how far I would let these people push me before I made the first move. I found the crack by accident, and then I started looking for more. like someone who suddenly notices a hairline fracture in a famous statue and then cannot stop staring until the whole thing looks unstable. It began with a footnote in an old city planning report, a line about deferred maintenance and temporary liquidity measures that made no sense for an institution like the Langley Institute, a place people treated like a cathedral of their own good taste. I was supposed to be writing a piece for a local magazine about community projects, and somehow that sentence felt personal, like a pinprick in skin I had forgotten I still had. I made a phone call, then another. I asked questions that sounded casual in my voice but were loaded like mines under the manicured lawns of their reputation. The museum curator, Alina, met me under fluorescent lights in a storage corridor they keep closed to the public. She had the look of someone who loves fragile things so much she has become one herself. She showed me a stack of ledgers and spreadsheets in a cracked leather folder because it was illegal for those numbers to be shown to just anyone. Her hands trembled a little when she flipped pages. There were line items I could parse in a blink, old loans rolled into newer loans like Russian dolls, interest that had been deferred into charity events, and a separate slush fund that no one wanted to talk about. We were told not to worry them, she said, meaning the public, meaning the donors who thought their names on the wall were permanents. We were told not to tell them how close we are. It did not take long for things to add up. The endowment had been partially pledged as collateral for a redevelopment project that never happened. Someone on the board had used museum funds to underwrite a private investment vehicle tied to the Langley family's real estate holdings. Those holdings had collapsed in a way no one wanted on their dinner plates, and the museum had been dragged into the quicksand. The final blow was a promissory note that matured at the end of the month, and the bank's lawyer who had been quietly sending threatening letters. They had a handful of days before a creditor moved to put a receiver in place and turn the Langley Institute's doors into a locked gate and a press release about mismanagement. As I traced the money, a name kept showing up in the margins like an ugly signature. Julian's signature. At first I refused to believe it. The idea that a Langley would treat a cultural institution like a ledger line was obscene, almost comical. Then I found emails, not just casual CCs but carefully worded memos, where Julian argued in favor of liquidity strategies and investment opportunities that benefited his own shell company. The more I dug, the more the scene in the dining room made sense. The casual contempt, the patronizing jokes. They had used the museum as a buffer for their lifestyle, for their bets, and when the bets soured, they put their hands out and expected the city, or the heirs of some older donor, or the public to clean up the mess. I did not go to the police. The police are a theater and the wealthy know how to rent out seats. I did not go to Claire because I needed to know whether she would stand up to them before I let the world know that I had the power to change things. I did what I do best. I built a plan like I used to build servers, with redundancy and anonymous keys and a firewall of paper. I started forming trusts and shell corporations the way a magician arranges mirrors. There were lawyers who specialized in keeping names out of headlines, bankers who could move big sums without asking about the morality of how the money would be spent, and a couple of old friends from my startup days who still practiced discretion like a religion. But this was not only about money. The Langley Institute had a wing named after my grandmother, a small brass plaque hidden under a glass display case in the folk art room. When I was a child, my grandmother would walk me here and tell me stories about the people in the photographs, how they arrived with nothing, and how the museum kept their memories so the world would not forget who had come before us. When the institution started cutting community outreach programs, when the board decided to auction off local artists to pay for repositioning, I felt something I could not allow to be erased. Saving the museum was keeping a promise to someone who had shown me that history matters even when no one is watching. There was a practical side too. If the Langley family lost the institute, their social power would change hands. People who used to be on their boards would move towards new patrons and new reputations. The Langleys would be forced to hobble along and beg for influence the same way they had made others beg. I could see, in a future I allowed myself to imagine and then cover quickly with detachment, the kinds of attorney letters and dinner conversations that would follow if the museum closed. I wanted to prevent that, but I wanted to do it in a way that could teach Claire a lesson about character without teaching her to humiliate anyone in return. The plan took shape in layers. First, an emergency line of credit to cover payroll and keep programs operating for 10 crucial weeks, structured so it could not be easily traced back through any one of my nonprofits. Second, a quiet restructuring of the museum's debt using a consortium of small local investors I trusted, people whose names would not make headlines but who had local roots and a stake in the city's cultural life. Third, a technology overhaul that would digitize key collections and open new revenue streams without compromising the museum's integrity. That technology was my language. I could build a platform that would bring a global audience to their exhibits and create microdonations that, when aggregated, would form a sustainable backbone. But every plan has a weakness, and mine was moral as much as logistical. The Langleys would not accept anonymous help forever. Their whole social architecture relies on the ritual of public credit. If I saved the Langley Institute and remained in the shadows, I would be an invisible hand behind a pulpit. It was a risk. They could refuse anonymity and force me into the open, exposing the test I had placed on Claire and perhaps shattering any chance of a genuine choice. Or worse, they could find the paper trail and use it to extract humiliation or debt or revenge. The clock on the promissory note pulsed like a countdown at the center of my chest. So I set a final condition in ink that no one would read until later. The money would arrive anonymously, but the anonymity could be dissolved by the head of the museum alone at a moment of their choosing at a public forum. I told my counsel that if the board refused the offer in anonymity, I would withdraw and let them fall. That condition would test whether the Institute and the family, and especially Claire, valued the preservation of culture more than the preservation of their own vanity. The choice was a sharp blade, and I was ready to see who would pick it up. They escalated like a storm that starts with a single gust and then takes the roof off. One day it was stifling smiles, the next it was choreography, dinners arranged just to watch me while they planned how to break Claire. I noticed it in the way Margaret began inviting Claire to family luncheons that always ended with a lecture about standing with your class. In the way Arthur started sending subtle messages through mutual friends about how a sensible marriage required sensible resources. They introduced Camden Rook at a charity polo match as if they were introducing a cure for something. He arrived like a headline, immaculate, smelling faintly of expensive whiskey and new money confidence, shaking my hand with the kind of grip that measures you like an object and decides whether to keep you on a shelf. Camden was the perfect instrument the Langleys chose to play. He had a foundation with a three-word name and a yacht with a more impressive name. He spoke fluent corporate philanthropy and smiled at cameras with the composition of a portrait made for the front page. He knew to let Claire hear about future stability and long-term legacy in the same breath. He told her privately and very sweetly about islands he might buy and schools he might fund, and how easy it would be to fix any problem with a check and a handshake. I watched from the far edge of a crowd the night they announced a small joint venture, how Claire lit up at the possibility of fewer worries, how her laugh slid into conversations she had stopped having with me. It felt like watching a tide pull at sand where my feet were anchored. The ultimatum arrived wrapped in silk and reason. Margaret took Claire aside in the conservatory where the ferns were perpetual and the floor always smelled faintly of lemon oil. I was not supposed to be there, I knew that, and yet I had parked my car around the corner and followed the sound of their voices because you watch for the moment when someone's life is forced to choose. Margaret's voice was soft but absolute. "You must decide by our winter gala," she said. "Either you accept what is offered and join us in the right circles, or you will be cut off. No more allowance, no introductions, no family trusts. You'll be free, but you'll live alone and on your own terms without our name behind you." The sentence hung like an executioner's blade that still waited to fall. Claire's face when she walked back to the terrace was an atlas of small defeats. She tried to meet my eyes, and for a second there was the girl I had loved, brave in her own way, ashamed but still trying to be honest. She told me, voice barely above the garden's hush, that her mother had made it sound merciful. She said she understood where the family's concern came from, that she did not want to drag me into their mess. There was a tremor in her hand when she spoke, the kind of tremor that comes from trying to hold a glass too long. I wanted to grab her, to say you do not have to choose their gold for their love, to demand a fight from her, but I did not. I needed whatever answer she gave to be hers, not a performance she assumed I desired. That night the vice tightened in ways I had not counted on. Julian, who until then had been a sharp, distant presence, started to appear in the corners of our lives like a fly on a wall. He smiled a smile that suggested he had calculated everything down to the last dime, and he began to call Claire with advice about preserving the family's legacy. He was kinder in public and crueler in practice. His investment vehicles were now firmly tied to Camden's new fund, and it became clear that Camden was not simply a rival to me, but a collaborator in consolidating the family's social capital. If Claire took Camden, the Langley network would reinforce their control with a new column of wealth and reputation. If she refused, she would be persuaded by attrition and isolation. I started to see the test in the small places she faltered and the places she held fast. At a rooftop party where the city's philanthropists sipped champagne and exchanged business cards like trading cards, she stood next to me and defended a community tech showcase that I had once taught at. That small defense, offered in a whisper between appetizers, felt like a defiant flicker. She bought a coffee for a teenager who wandered in asking about scholarships, and when her mother snorted at the gesture, Claire met the look with an apology for reasons that sounded almost like shame and almost like pride. Those moments told me she had not entirely surrendered, but they also told me she was scared, so scared she might do something unimaginable to keep herself safe. The logistical timeline tightened into a single cruel line. The museum's promissory note would mature 2 weeks before the winter gala. Margaret's ultimatum would expire on the evening of the gala. The same hall where they planned to brand me a charity case would become the place where the museum might be forced to close its doors. The pressure was not theoretical anymore. It was a countdown that sat on every table, in every private conversation, and in the chrome finish of Camden's watch. I felt the weight of both clocks pressing against my sternum. I had a plan to save the Institute, to pull the rug out from under their smug certainty, but I also had something else tightening. The knowledge that I had placed Claire in the middle of a moral firing line. There is a cruelty in tests that I did not fully acknowledge to myself then. I knew I was making a wager with her heart as currency. I justified it in my head the way people justify experiments on themselves. The result would reveal truth. But at nights when the city's lights looked like scattered cinders, I confessed to myself my fear that I had misread something essential. If she chose money over us, I wanted to know it was her true choice rather than the sound of a door closing on her sense of safety. If she chose me, I wanted the choice to be brave and not coerced. Between the ticking promissory note and Margaret's ultimatum, the vice closed. I tightened my own jaw and waited to see which of us would bend first. The invitation arrived the way they like their power to arrive. Embossed heavy, with my name spelled like a charity joke and a handwritten little note from Claire that smelled faintly of her perfume and something like apology. They sent it as a dare. They imagined me opening that envelope at my kitchen table and laughing with the wrong kind of laugh. They imagined, because they always imagined, that they could orchestrate the narrative for everyone else and leave me to play the part they had already written. I slid the card into my pocket and drove toward the Langley estate that night thinking of choreography, of predators arranging their steps around prey, and how theater is most effective when the audience believes the lines are real. When I arrived, the valet rolled his eyes and pretended not to see the scuffs on my shoes. The driveway smelled like champagne and diesel, a contradiction that made my teeth ache. Inside, the ballroom had been turned into a cathedral of reflection and reputation. The stage was lit like a confession booth, and the walls reflected 1,000 versions of the same proud family. They had set the tables in concentric circles, as if the whole room existed to orbit their small, omnipotent center. I could feel their eyes performing a slow sweep over me, cataloging the way I held my jacket, counting how many buttons were wrong. That cataloging is their sport. Julian floated through the room like someone who owns the air. He had arranged for a program that would both celebrate the Langley Institute and more specifically demonstrate what they thought was my place in the world. A token exhibit of grassroots charm that the sponsors could applaud and then forget. They introduced a segment called Community Makers and placed it directly after the donor roll call. My face was on the screen for 30 seconds, cropped and captioned as Local Innovator with images of my old workshop and a grainy photo of my dented car. The camera panned and the laugh track in the model of their social circle played in the back of the room like distant thunder. People who had never paid me a compliment before clinked glasses at the joke. Camden, resplendent and conversationally poisonous, took the stage with that slow smile of his. He spoke about stewardship and the necessity of appropriate alliances as if alliances were a kind of vineyard property that needed pruning. He mentioned sensible marriages in a languid aside. The audience laughed in the places they were told to. Claire sat 3 rows back, her hands folded in her lap like someone trying to hold on to the edges of herself. For a second, a heat like a foreign sun rose in my chest, equal parts fury and the coldest sorrow I've ever known. I felt small in the way a matchstick must feel under a chandelier. I had rehearsed restraint because I had a plan that required patience, but restraint thins like paper if you leave it too long. At the micro level, the family had other cruelties prepared. A friendly poet was hired to recite a piece about the noble struggle of humble beginnings, and the cadence of the lines landed as knife points. A slideshow showed a timeline that subtly juxtaposed my early career and the Langley's legacy in a way that implied lineage was a moral currency and everything else a debt. Reporters scribbled notes and smiled the smile that promises to publish teeth. The Langley network had made humiliation into an art form, and tonight it was being framed as philanthropy. I watched Claire as the room cheered at each barb joke, and I wanted to pull the tablecloth out from under everyone's china. But the final insult had its apex choreographed for the end, when Margaret would rise and issue the family ultimatum in the ceremonial language she used for deaths in slow motion. She took the stage wearing white as if she were a judge, and when she spoke she did so with the deliberate clarity of someone reading a sentence that would be quoted. "We are caretakers of this institution," she said, and the camera cut to a close-up of her hand that wore a ring older than the museum's wing. "We will not have our legacy diluted by sentimental arrangements." The room applauded as if they were absolving a sin, and then she lowered her voice, a small, tight thing that reached me like an arrow. "We have invited our friend tonight not out of charity but to show why the choices we make matter." When the words landed, the room turned its face into a blade. People who had pretended to be curious now performed contempt as if it were a virtue. Somewhere in that movement I saw Julian exchange a nod with a man I recognized from bank meetings. It was a small, private puppet show where the strings were money and the performers were oblivious. Margaret's hand signaled the band to play, and the orchestra obliged with a sentimental swell that felt like a public gavel. Cameras tilted toward me, as if the night had been designed to treat me like a specimen pinned beneath glass. Claire came up to me as if on a string, eyes glossed and quiet. She whispered, the words almost inaudible beneath the hum, that they wanted an answer now. That sounded like mercy from someone who believed mercy could be scheduled. My training in silence never felt so much like a betrayal. I wanted to tell her that the museum's ledger was a cliff and my money was a rope. But instead I folded the answer into my voice and said, "I will be where I belong," and left the sentence hanging with as much dignity as I could manufacture. I left the reply ambiguous because I wanted her choice to be uncoerced when the time came rather than a performance stopped by my reveal. Outside in the icy air, the valet offered to retrieve my car and do the small favor of a smooth exit. The press clustered like moths. For a moment, alone on the curb with the town's glitter fanning back toward the mansion, I felt the same old electric hum I felt when my code finally compiled after a week of sleepless editing. Behind that hum, the clock ticking on the museum's debt was louder than any sneer placed inside that room. The final insult was not simply for me, it was a public audition for who would inherit their power. I pocketed the evening's collateral, her small note, the program with my face on it, and walked back inside ready to watch the rest of the play unfold, because sometimes to pull the curtain you have to let the actors believe the scene is still theirs. I finished most of the wiring at 2 in the morning, hands shaking from coffee and the kind of adrenaline that feels like grief. The plan had been a maze of contingencies, more legal knots than a sailor's rope, and every clause had to be airtight because the Langleys were predators in silk and would smell a tail. I watched the last confirmation come through on a screen in a dim co-working booth, a tiny green except that felt louder than a gunshot in my chest. The promissory note that would have let a receiver walk into the museum and shut the doors was being bought, paid, and retired in one clean, anonymous sweep. Payroll was immediately covered. Program funding was guaranteed for the next decade. Endowment restructuring moved forward through a trust with a governance clause that forced transparency, community representation, and a veto that would prevent any single family member from using the museum like a private checking account again. It was not just a bailout. It was built to make it much harder for a Langley to turn heritage into leverage. I had not done this through some cinematic single-wire transfer with my name attached. That would have been too easy and, frankly, too satisfying in the wrong way. The money had the taste of a dozen other people's fingerprints because I wanted plausibility to look like a town's love for its own institution rather than a personal act of power. The conduit was an amalgam of small local investors, a foundation set up under a dead grandmother's name, and a private equity vehicle that specialized in cultural assets. An old colleague, Jonah, who still owed me a favor from the early days when he slept under a desk because we were building something nobody thought would work, agreed to be the trustee. He signed his name in a conference room that smelled of stale bagels and determination, and it was his name the bank would see if anyone poked around. I trusted Jonah because he hated spectacle the same way I did. He loved making things work. There was a moment when I imagined Julian in a dark suit throwing his newspapers onto a mahogany desk and calling every lawyer he knew to unravel the threads. I expected him to try to trace the money, to threaten the museum with counter-litigation, to use the very laws he claimed to respect as blunt instruments against people who could not fight back. So we hedged. One portion of the funds bought the promissory note outright at a private auction at the bank's discretion. Another portion flowed into an irrevocable escrow that automatically released when certain governance thresholds were met. If a receiver's paperwork arrived at City Hall before the escrow was activated, the bank would find that the debt had already changed hands and there would be nothing for them to seize. It felt like watching a chess game where I had finally set the board so the king could not move without exposing important pieces. No one had noticed. Alina met me at dawn in the museum's back corridor under those fluorescent lights that make everyone's face honest. She had been the only person inside the walls who had not asked questions about motive. She unfolded a legal schedule with hands that trembled the way an old leaf trembles in fall wind. If this goes through, she said, voice low and brave, we can keep the community programs. We can keep the folk art room open. We can pay the interns. We can rebuild trust. I told her what was necessary about anonymity and my condition, the one clause that still mattered to me. The anonymity could be dissolved only by her, by the director of the museum alone at a time she chose in public. The words landed with an odd weight, as if they had to be soft so they would not shatter. She nodded and insisted on secrecy the way priests insist on sacraments. The board, once briefed in a quiet midnight call with lawyers on mute, swore an oath that sounded ancient and thin over the law. The legal language contained teeth that would ensure not just survival but structural change. The trust created a civic oversight committee with 3 seats reserved for people from neighborhoods the museum had neglected, one of which I quietly filled with a former student from my workshop, whose application letter had been the most honest plea I'd ever received. The museum's digital platform I had funded would be built with open-source principles, meaning the Langleys could no longer gatekeep access to their treasures as if culture were a VIP list. There was even a clause to audit any real estate dealings related to the museum for the next 15 years. The idea of Julian baiting the institution again felt suddenly smaller, like a man who had been outmaneuvered by rule rather than by force. After everything was signed, after the lawyers whispered and stamped and handed over hardware tokens and passwords, I sat on a bench beneath the museum's rotunda and traced my grandmother's plaque with fingertips that had once been poor and stubborn. I am not the kind of person who likes applause. I had no interest in the social currency it would give me in the Langley orbit. This was for memory, because my grandmother taught me that places keep the stories of the people who built them and that some stories are worth more than any ledger line. I thought about Claire, about how the test I had designed would either split her open or reveal her. I thought about the cold, formal gala in a few nights, the little speech, the final insult they were preparing to deliver. I pictured Margaret's face when a microphone suddenly introduced a donor who had not been invited as the savior of their institution. If anyone thought it would be me, they would be wrong. That was the point. Before I left, Alina folded the trustee documents and placed one copy in a locked safe behind a painting of the town's founder. She looked at me with wet eyes, the kind filled with everything people attempt to hold when history offers a do-over. The board will announce this at the gala, she said, the decision already made in her voice. We will thank an anonymous donor and honor the conditions. We will keep the donor's name hidden until I say otherwise. It was a quiet coup. They had to keep the secret to keep their social choreography intact, but when the morning press release came, it would be a small earthquake. I walked out into the city's gray light feeling monstrously calm, as if the air in the world had become a little more honest. The gloves had been off and the first blows had been struck not in anger but in quiet justice. The driveway to the Langley ballroom felt like a runway for judgments. Valets in lacquered black hands took coats with the casual cruelty of people who handle other people's warmth for sport. Photographers clicked like nervous insects, and their flashes turned my face into a sequence of stop-motion images, each one edged with somebody's opinion. I walked with my jacket buttoned, like a man in a costume who hoped the costume would convince people he belonged. The room itself was a universe of polished surfaces and rehearsed generosity. I felt every eye that passed over me catalogue my shoes, my posture, my silence, as if they were appraising a painting they had already decided was a forgery. Inside, the air had the smell of citrus and old perfume, and the kind of quiet that fills rooms before a verdict is read. Tables were arranged like altars and candles bent toward them in the same way everyone bent toward the family at the head table. Margaret sat as if gravity itself had been instructed to keep her upright and disdainful. Arthur looked like a man who had rehearsed being benevolent in front of a mirror, and decided to keep only the practiced lines. Julian drifted through his orbit with the slow grin of a man who believes he has accounted for every variable. Camden stood a little apart, polished, leaning into the role the Langleys had scripted for him, a solution with a ledger attached. The murmurs followed me like a scent. Someone near the terrace joked about how ironic it was that a man who taught kids to solder circuits would show up when the lights were this bright. A woman whose name I recognized from plaque dedications patted a man on the arm and said under her breath that I must be grateful for any table crumbs I was offered. Claire's family made their amusement a group sport. Laughter moved from cluster to cluster as if thrown like confetti. I could feel my face grow colder with every chuckle that carried my name as if I were an exhibit rather than a person. I told myself to breathe, to let the evening play out, to hold whatever dignity I had left like a lit candle. Claire was the worst and the best of the night. She drifted between the Langley circle and me like a boat caught between two currents. When she smiled at me, it was small and private, like she was conserving warmth to keep something alive, but she also wore the language of strain in the way her shoulders tightened and the way her laughter cut off too quickly. We had shared one hallway conversation that afternoon, the sort of whisper that counts as a lifeline. She told me they were leaning on her hard and that saying yes to Camden would be easier for both of them and for the people who depended on the Langley name. Her eyes, when they found mine in the crowd, always looked a degree farther away than they used to, like she was measuring distance to decide which one to cross. The family began their choreography just past the first course. Julian, with the soft cruelty of someone who has never been denied, steered a conversation close enough to my table that the sound felt like a blade. Margaret leaned forward, eyes like bookmarks, and used the sort of language that translates benevolence into indifference. You must see how these events require a certain alignment, she said, and people nodded as if the phrase were a prayer. Arthur, always careful to appear magnanimous, asked how my work kept me grounded, and when I answered in the simplest terms, his smile folded into a polite sneer. The room hummed with the comfortable cruelty of wealth defending its borders. Then came the moment I had feared and expected in equal measure, the one they had likely rehearsed in their heads for months. Margaret rose as if every chair in the room were a juror waiting to be discharged. Her voice cut through the clink of glass and her words were polished like a directive. She spoke of stewardship, of legacies, of the right people carrying the torch. The speech was not entirely about me, but it was never not about me, and toward the end she shaped an ultimatum out of civility and placed it like a weight on Claire's shoulders. My heart cracked in a way that no person should have to feel, because the choice being staged was not simply between two men. It was between a life tethered to a name and a life that could be whatever Claire wanted it to be. After the speech, the space around my table tightened like a noose. Julian and Camden moved with the ease of men who think invitations mean admission, and they cornered me with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Other guests drifted away like buoys, leaving us in the current where the family's judgment could be most fierce. Margaret's voice, when it turned to me, was cool and practiced and wrapped in the polite language of someone delivering a funeral oration for hope. They wanted an answer. They wanted me to take the fall and make the choice obvious to the world. Claire stood between ambition and tenderness, and I saw the rawness of it on her face. I squared my shoulders, felt the hum of the night as if it were a circuit waiting for a spark, and prepared to let the moment land because whatever came next would not simply be humiliation. It would be a revelation. When the museum director climbed the stage, the room tilted as if someone had nudged the planet, and the polite clinking of glasses faded into a kind of holy hush you only hear before an altar is overturned. She looked smaller than I had expected, not because of stature, but because she carried the weight of something people pay attention to without understanding, like the last keeper of a flame. Her voice started low, steady, and then she spoke the kind of sentence that rearranges the furniture in a life. The Langley Institute had been closer to collapse than anyone had known, and they had only days before a creditor would have put a receiver at the door. Those words landed like a thrown stone. You could see the ring of shock expand across the room, the polite faces folding inward. People who had sat above the museum like they were its crown suddenly looked like witnesses at a trial where they were the accused. My pulse turned into a drum in my ears. For a moment I wanted to stand and shout that it was a lie, that I had engineered events like a watchmaker fiddling with springs. But Alina kept speaking, and every calm fact she gave was a pillow under the panic, pushing the truth flat and unavoidable. She walked the crowd through the numbers, the promissory note, the bank's quiet letters, and when those names landed, names that had only been whispers in dark rooms, the murmurs sharpened into dissonance. Cameras found faces, phones lit. Reporters leaned in like detectives who smelled trouble. Margaret's jaw, which had been set like a stone paperweight, began to move as if searching for a sentence that would absolve her of the way her family had treated the place for sport. Then Alina changed the tenor of her voice to something that sounded like relief, and the room breathed with her. She announced that the institute had been saved by a single anonymous donor, that payroll had been covered, programs secured, and that a long-term structure had been put in place to prevent a repeat of the mismanagement. For a blink, everyone clapped for the idea of rescue itself, the abstract of charity divorced from the messy people who give or take it. And then, with a composure that made my ribs ache, she said she had one more thing to do. The donor had requested anonymity but had left the decision to reveal himself to her, and he had also left specific conditions that required a public acceptance. She asked the anonymous donor to come to the stage. A sound like suction moved through the room, an intake that could have been a gasp, a laugh, or the sound of a playwright realizing the actors were improvising. Margaret's eyes went flat and hunting, like a woman who suddenly remembered where she hid her heirlooms. Julian shifted as if expecting to spring a trap. People looked at one another for signals. For those 2 heartbeats, I felt the entire world pin itself to a needle and swing. Then Alina pointed. Her finger was not theatrical. It was precise and tired and aimed right at me as if she had been holding that point in reserve. The camera found my face in a second. Flashes exploded like small storms. The laughter died, and the sound that replaced it was a collective, stunned intake. Julian's face lost color the way a photograph does when wet. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as if she had been struck. Camden's practiced composure thinned into something like calculation. Someone shouted a question, was he really? And someone else called for decorum as if decorum could put the tide back in its place. For a moment I felt the old instinct to disappear, to melt into the wallpaper and let the orchestra play on without me. But Alina had already set the stage. She stepped away from the microphone and looked at me with a look I could only describe as invitation and absolution braided together. The conditions I had insisted upon, the clause that only she could dissolve anonymity, had not been a trap or a test of cleverness. It had been a key I had entrusted to the one person who loved the museum more than the family's pride. I moved through the room feeling the press of 1,000 judgments like hands on my shoulders, and when I reached the stage I saw Claire standing at the edge of the crowd with her hands clenched so hard her knuckles were white. Her face was a geography of decisions. There was fear there, of course, but beneath it a thin, stubborn gladness, as if she somehow knew the chessboard's endgame even as pieces fell. Alina nodded to me and then, in the kind of voice that holds storms back with a single hand, handed me a microphone. The sound of my voice felt foreign at first, like a stranger had borrowed my words, but I let it settle and then I spoke. I told them the truth in a way I had not allowed myself in private. That I had been testing Claire because I wanted to know whether the woman I loved would choose a name stuck like a badge, or whether she would choose a life she could make on her own terms. I told them the truth about why the museum mattered to me, that my grandmother had shown me its rooms when I was a child, and gave me a sense of the world that no bank could underwrite. I told them the mechanics, publicly enough to be credible, not so much as to be spectacle, about the trust, the escrow, and the governance that would prevent this from ever being a private piggy bank again. And then, with my voice calmer than my heart, I said why I had done it anonymously. Because I wanted the institution saved without needing the theater of gratitude that would let the Langleys convert charity into social armor. When I finished, I expected to be booed, to be scolded for playing judge in private affairs. Instead, something shifted. A few people clapped in the awkward way people clap when a curtain falls and the play has been better than they expected. Some of the older donors looked as if relief had wrung wrinkles out of their faces. Margaret stood frozen, a woman caught between fury and a new kind of impotence. Julian tried to patrol his expression into an attack, but Alina, with the quiet of someone who had already voted with both hands, pressed a small envelope into the museum chair's hand and asked the director to display certain emails on the screen. They rolled like old wounds on a projector, Julian's signature on memos that repurposed museum funds, spreadsheets showing transfers into shell accounts. The crowd inhaled. You could see the social scaffolding of the Langleys wobble. Claire's face finally crumpled and then, without a plan and with a force that surprised both of us, she ran up and put her arms around my waist as if trying to press the world back into the way it used to be. In that instant, with cameras snapping and the room's noise folding into a single thread of chaos, I understood what it meant to be the most powerful person in their world. It was not the money. It was that I had made a choice that shifted where power could be held, and that suddenly the Langleys' monopoly on influence looked ordinary and exposed. Margaret scooped her dignity like a cloak and made a speech about propriety that came out thin and apologetic. Julian muttered of litigation while the legal terms of the trust left him impotent. Camden smiled as if he had been hired to play contingency and then realized the show had no need of his role. When the night folded into its new shape, cameras circling like scavengers, I felt the strange peace that comes after a long program compiles without errors. The work had been done, the right people were placed where they could protect the memory, and Claire's choice was visible, raw, and for the first time real. I had come to be someone the Langley circle could dismiss, and I left as the man who had decided the future of their most cherished thing. The applause that rose as Alina closed the announcement was not only for salvation. It was, in a strange way, for the end of a dynasty's right to decide what legacy meant. For a second the room stopped being a room. Sound folded like a book and someone slammed the spine shut. Forks lay midair, champagne glasses paused like frozen music, and the chandelier seemed to hang lower as if it were listening. People who had practiced indignation their whole lives looked suddenly small and astonished, not angry but bewildered, because the map they had used to navigate this city had been quietly redrawn under their feet. Margaret's face registered the exact moment entitlement met an immovable fact. Her mouth opened and closed like someone trying to remember a line they had never been given. Julian's brow went hard and then weirdly blank as if systems that had always turned for him had been unplugged. Camden, who had rehearsed charity speeches in the mirror, blinked with the look of a man who had shown up to play a part and found the script missing. I watched the glitter fall into that silence and felt my own heartbeat like a metronome counting the seconds between what had been and what would be. The projector still rolled the incriminating documents across the screen behind us, the emails and transfers in cold black text, and people who had considered themselves stewards of culture now saw ledger lines that suggested stewardship had been a costume. A server clinked, a phone slipped, and somewhere a guest swore softly into a napkin. The hush made my throat dry, but the dryness was not from nerves. It was the same dry that comes after you finish patching a system at 3 in the morning and finally hit save, the moment when you know the fix will hold. Alina handed me the microphone like a baton, and for a beat I simply held it, letting the weight remind me this was not about a showdown. It was about the museum, about the people whose names were not on plaques but whose lives lived inside those rooms. I began to speak, and my voice at first felt strange in that sea of expectations, but the words came easier than I expected because they were true, and truth has the odd habit of being comfortable to say. I said I had no interest in being crowned in their society, that I had wanted only to protect a place that had given me a sense of continuity when my life was otherwise a series of small disappearances. I said the donation was not an arrow meant to wound, but a bolt meant to mend, that power, as I saw it, was the ability to stop things from being lost. I told them I had never intended to humiliate anyone. That secrecy was a guardrail against spectacle and against the way gratitude can be used as a leash. I explained in plain phrases how the trust would work, about community oversight and audits, and how the governance would prevent a single family from treating the museum like a private ledger again. I spoke of kids in my workshop who had found the courage to build something because someone had shown them their work mattered, and I said that the museum had to be a place where stories did not require a name on a marble slab to matter. My words were simple and blunt and meant to do something odd in that room, to reframe what prestige looked like. There was no swagger in my speech, only the quiet of someone who had finished repairing something fragile. Claire listened with an intensity that made me think of portraits my grandmother loved, faces that looked like maps. Her hands were unclasped now, not clenched, and when I mentioned the folk art room, she let out a breath that sounded almost like permission. I had planned for her to be tested by silence, by the weight of choice, not with theatrics, but by the raw facts of what would happen if she chose the easy lane. She had seen what the easy lane had looked like tonight. Applause that hid handwriting, alliances that rearranged museums like chess trophies. In a moment that feels smaller when you try to describe it and enormous when you remember it, Claire stepped forward. She walked across the distance between the family and me like she was crossing a room to put down a heavy thing and then walk away lighter. When she reached the stage, the room found its volume again, and a dozen phones pinged in a dozen pockets, but she did not falter. She took my hand in front of everyone, public and private, and then looked at her mother and at the board and said, plain as winter, that she would not be bartered. She said she had loved a man who built things that mattered, and that she would rather be poor with a person who kept his promises than rich under the weight of someone else's name. Her voice cracked and then steadied, like a bridge bearing its first load. For the first time in months, I saw the unambiguous joy that comes from people who choose themselves. Privilege recoiled like an animal that smelled blood in a new way. Margaret's face shifted through a dozen expressions, none of them pretty, as the cameras zoomed in on a royal family that had been unseated in the simplest mode possible. Relevance redefined. Julian tried a few legal jabs, predicting lawsuits and slandering motives, but the trust's legal scaffolding made threats look like theater, and the city papers were already parsing the documents Alina had presented. Camden, who had relied on alliances to buy him a place in the room, disappeared into the crowd like an actor whose exit music had been pulled. Guests murmured about precedents and audits and market reactions, as if culture were solely a line on an analyst's graph. But the kids who had been in my workshop a year ago were in the balcony with their parents, and their faces were lit in a way that made the room's gilding look small. When the applause finally rose, it was not the forced, polite clapping I'd heard before. It was rough and genuine, and for the first time in a long while it was clear what the town valued, not the size of a ledger but the courage to reframe legacy as stewardship rather than ownership. People began to speak differently to one another across the room. Old donors asked Alina questions about committees. A patron I'd met once, someone who ran a small bakery downtown, whispered into my ear that he would match a microdonation program I had proposed. It felt like watching an ecosystem start to breathe again after a choke. Power had shifted not with a flourish but with a set of rules and a handful of brave choices, and the Langley family's monopoly on narrative had been, in the space of an evening, cracked open. Later, when the papers would write about how the young innovator humbled the elite, and pundits would try to slap simple headlines on a messy night, I would think of Claire's hand in mine and Alina's tired, steady eyes. I had not come to be a king of anyone. I had come to be a steward to show what happened when accountability replaced spectacle. The Langley name still hung on the museum's stone, but its power had been redistributed into meetings and audits, and the sound of children learning to solder in a room that would not vanish because a ledger said so. That was the crown I accepted, not the glitter, but the responsibility to keep things alive for people who could not buy their way into history.